Okay, one of the things that digital sound can be used for is used in visual media. And as we all know, film, video games, animations, all sorts of media forms are where you will find sound design being used. All the techniques we've been learning in this class should be applied to any of these different kind of media forms. So today I want to talk a little bit about just the introductory ideas and concepts around when you do start to use digital sound design for film or TV production and so forth. There are just a few kind of basic ideas. Much of this will require much more extensive work to be able to work with a film director or a TV producer or so forth. That will require much more integrated work with them in designing the concepts of the piece and understanding the characters and the narrative and so forth. But what I want to do today is just kind of give you a quick overview of the basic ideas and to get you started on, if you were to have an opportunity to work in this, the kind of things you would expect. So when we talk about sound in film or different kind of media forms, we can talk about them perhaps in four different categories. Obviously, in a film, there's going to be dialogue. And when you're dealing with the dialogue, you're dealing with how do you record the dialogue? Do you record the sound of the dialogue as it's being spoken? Or do you add the dialogues later with it sort of synced, dubbed in? There are many options for that. When we're dealing with sound design for dialogue, often what we're going to be working with is once the sound is recorded, we need to make sure we have the correct microphone to capture the best quality of sound, to make sure the levels are very high. And then we'll probably be going to be working a lot with equalization, which we've talked about. How can we make that sound be more crisp or be more full to bring the sound forward so we can hear and understand the words? So a lot of the sound processing and digital sound techniques we've learned would be applied into recording the dialogue and then processing it later through various kinds of effects processing. Mainly equalization is the thing you'll be working with in dialogue. Another category of sound in media is going to be called effects. So the sound effects is any sound other than dialogue that is you hear coming out of the story. So that's anything from what you hear as far as the ambient sounds or different kind of effects that people are making in the story. So that's probably the biggest category of what we're going to be talking about today, are what are the different kind of sound effects and how can we learn to sort of shape those, and what kind of resources do we need to produce sound effects. As I mentioned, the atmosphere or the ambiance is another sort of separate category, which is not necessarily the sounds being made by the actors and the objects in the story, but it may be the sound of the environment around whatever setting they're in, whether they're in a room, they're outside, whether there's traffic noise, whether there's wind or storms. So ambient noise is another sort of subcategory of the kind of effects that we'll be putting into a sound design for a film. And then finally, we talk about is there music involved? Most films and TV will have some amount of music in the piece. There are many films that specifically don't allow any music in that, but most of the time you will find music being used in that. So when you talk about a film score or someone who writes a film score, composers, we think of in the West, John Williams, some big names of film score. Those are composers who are writing music which is designed for the film music, which is not necessarily coming all the times from the film story itself, but is being added as a layer on top of that. So that's a whole other world into itself, and understanding how to become a film composer is really getting closer to compositional kind of questions. So we won't have time in this particular course to really get involved in all the different compositional and orchestration kinds of techniques that understand that, but I do want to talk about really what that involves if you do move into film scoring and composing, the kind of things you would need to expect. Each of these categories, when you look at big blockbuster films, whether it's coming out of Mumbai, in the Bollywood film industry, or in Hollywood or other film centers, each of these categories will have very specific technical people who are working on them separately. So you'll have sound editors who are focusing just on the recording of the dialogue and the processing of that. And then you'll have large teams of people who are doing the different kind of effects processing. And then there'll be a whole different set of editors who are working specifically on just the background, the ambient sounds. And then obviously the music score, if there is one, will be designed by a composer, and often the composer will have orchestrators, editors, all sorts of other people working for he or she. So the sound editing is a very large group of people involved in this. So let's talk about what involved in sound editing. The essential piece of equipment used for sound editing is as we've looked at in this class, the multi-track digital audio workstation, or the DAW. So the standard DAW system that you'll find in American film industries as of 2012 is the most common one is the Avid Pro Tools system, which is the majority of those in film studios are running on Macintosh computers, but they do also run on PC as well. There are several other DAW systems that do have the capability of importing video so that you can sync the video to the audio. So the Mark of the Unicorn digital performer system has that, the Cubase systems have that, as well as the Logic, the Apple Logic systems all have that. So any system that allows you to import a video file and then to sync that to the running of the audio, you would be able to do your sound editing with that. So the sound effects and the sound library are a big part of the toolbox, essentially, for anyone involved with sound editing. So they usually will have different kind of organized sound library catalogs that you would have of different sound effects for different purposes on that. And these are often commercially available. You can buy hundreds and hundreds of different sound effects or different kind of sounds, recordings of nature and so forth that you can put into your films. But you can also make your own, and that's part of what we learned in this class, is if you wanted to record different kind of sound effects yourself and then make your own sample library, you would have the technique and the probabilities of doing that with these techniques. So sound in film, one of the things that we've talked about in this course is how to manipulate timbre, reverb, the different kind of effect processing, how to identify the pitch corrections and equalization of sound. All of these oral properties of sound are really important in doing sound design because you can shape a film aesthetic based upon what kind of reverb, what kind of timbre you create, and a lot of films will have the sound in a very specific kind of approach to the timbre and the level of the volume, whether the sound is extremely loud or very soft and blended in with background involvement. So a lot of times with the film producer, there will be strategies about what is the aesthetic we want the sound and the visual relationship to have. So this relationship is quite important. In adding sound to visual, one of the things that many theorists talk about is that sound, by nature of what it is obviously a function of time. So we have sound emerging in time, so that sound, when you bring sound into a visual relationship, it brings in something of motion and projects time. So that we have movement, we have time, and that's what sound will often bring to the visual image. Often you don't use sound if you're trying to create stasis in the film, because sound by default will give us that sense of movement and time. So sound will have very particular impact when you do bring it in. So many times when you have a scene that does not need to project a lot of motion, where you want a stillness of quality, then you have to be very careful about the kind of sounds you use and the loudness of those sounds, because otherwise it will make people feel like the ideas are starting to move, and there needs to be some kind of transition to that. So as we know, most films will tell a story. There's a narrative basis to films. And usually each film will have its own sort of filmic world as we define it. When we talk about all of the objects, the ideas, the sounds, the dialogue, the narrative in the film, that's referred to theoretically as the diegesis. So we have the diegesis, which is everything emanating from the story itself. Everything outside that we would be applying to that story is the non-diegetic, or the non-diegesis. So we're going to be talking about the difference between those two and in relationship to all the different kinds of qualities that we can then create sound design. So for example, the film score often is a non-diegetic sound that's added to it. It's not sound that's emerging from the characters or from objects in the story itself. This is something that we apply outside the story, and that becomes then part of the non-diegetic qualities of sound. If we have someone doing a voiceover narration that's not coming from one of the characters on stage, for example, that's another non-diegetic sound that we add to that. It's adding something about giving information about the story, but it's not emanating from the characters themselves. So when we talk about doing sound design, we have to think in terms of whether we're working in the diegetic or the non-diegetic field. So any kind of music that we hear outside the story is going to be non-diegetic. But a lot of times you can have music that is being played in the scene itself. For example, if the musicians are in a club and they're walking through a dance club or a bar and there's music you're hearing there, that is part of the scene. So then that becomes music for diegetic purposes. So a lot of times when you're composing music, you will be composing it for that diegetic purpose, and then it clearly has to have a relationship to the characters. If it's non-diegetic music that you're producing for a score, it often is adding some other kind of function, emotional content, or for transitions, or for continuity or unity of ideas. We'll talk more about that in just a second. So diegetic, let's talk more a little bit about those sounds. So the kind of diegetic sounds that we'll be working with are voices of the characters, the dialogue, that's obviously coming, the primary diegetic sounds that we'll be recording and manipulating. Sounds made by objects in the story. So if there is the sound of something hitting a table, or there is an object that is making sound in the story, that we have to have an effect applied to that if we don't record it in the sound. So that's something coming from the objects themselves have to be recorded or else produced. Here again, part of the diegetic family. And then, as I mentioned before, any kind of source music that comes out of the scene. If it's a radio or someone's playing their CD, different kind of sounds coming from that, that is also within the story as well. And then basic sound effects, such as dogs barking or cars passing by, traffic, wind noise, so forth. All those are part of that as well. So the diegetic sound can be coming both from the things we see on screen, but they can also be coming off screen. If someone is in a room, a character is in a room, and they hear the sound coming from next door, or they hear a sound coming from outside. Let's say they hear a siren coming down the street. That we don't see the actual ambulance or the police car, but we hear that sound and it gives us a reference to that sound. That's, here again, a diegetic sound because it's part of the action of the story. Same thing on a voice. You could have voice that is coming from a character on stage, or it could be coming off stage. So these questions of diegetic versus non-diegetic, you may be something that we infer from the characters. If it's something that the character on stage is not hearing, that's usually the dividing line between diegetic and non-diegetic. So if one or more of the characters in the scene can, in their imagination, hear that sound, then it's part of the diegetic family of sounds. So the non-diegetic category would be things such as narrators. If you have a narrator giving commentary about what's happening on this scene, or some outside third-party voice that's reflecting upon what's happening or setting up the scene for the next chronological change, all that is not part of the original character's voices, so it's non-diegetic. Obviously, sound effects, which are added for dramatic effect, that are not emanating from objects on the screen, or any kind of mood music or film music, as we mentioned before, are the main categories. These usually will create atmosphere or different kind of emotional moods, as we mentioned. So if right now I want you all to take a look at this address on youtube.com. If you go there, there's a 9-minute video clip which really explains the difference between diegesis and non-diegesis, and really sort of demonstrates examples of film. Now let's talk more about the audio-visual relationships. When we're putting sound to visual, and this is something that you would talk to your film director with about, there are a lot of times where you can have the sound that will try to be in harmony, we might say, with the visual image. So if you're trying to create a scene and the sound is going to amplify or try to reinforce the ideas of the narration or the things that are presented in that, we talk about that as being in a harmonic relationship to the audio, to the visual. But many times you may want something that may be referred to as audiovisual dissonance, where you have a scene which may be projecting one emotion, but there may be some other kind of sound quality that is creating what we call a dissonance, or a kind of a counterpoint to the visual relationship. And that can be done for very specific kind of film purposes. Maybe you're trying to have a scene which on one level looks like it's very serene and everything is friendly and these two characters are in line with each other, but the music is reflecting something darker and more ominous and maybe is not reflecting what's happening in the scene you're seeing. That could be a premonition of advanced knowledge of what may be happening later to those characters. So a lot of times the music can be playing a narrative function, kind of guiding the viewer of the film to certain ideas that maybe aren't present in the scene we're watching. So this relationship of whether we do harmonic or counterpoint is an important part of each scene of how the music functions in that. So one of the most common functions of film sound is either unifying or binding the flow of images. That's often what we're doing when you're trying to design sound, whether it's music or sound effects. It's going to be usually for the unification of different images, because many times you'll have a lot of scenes that are flowing through. Some of the scene changes may be quite disjunct at times, and so that's where the sound score is a critical part of making the film feel like it's flowing smoothly from these disjunct scenes. So you would have sound to overlap, whereas visual breaks would be one thing. Second, it would bring sort of, by creating an atmosphere to the scene, it connects a lot of disjunct scenes into one unity, because the commonality of the atmosphere would make them all feel like they're part of one logical idea. And then you can sort of provide sort of a unity through the non-diegetic music. And this is the film scoring is a big part of what the composers are doing, is trying to create unity through the kind of music that they choose.